that everybody's been asking in the last 12 or so hours, it does look very likely probably the tipping point or the highest point in tensions between the United States and Iran since Donald Trump took office not that long ago. However, I think there's a lot going on in Tehran that could possibly de-escalate this crisis. I don't think the Iranians want to jump into a war. It's not a war that they can win, at least in a conventional sense. So there are moves, I suppose, to de-escalate or at least consider what happens next in a strategic sense, but also short-term but also long-term considerations.
So what do you mean by that? Is there really hope for de-escalation or diplomacy at this point?
I wouldn't call it diplomacy. I think from the Iranian perspective, given what happened with the nuclear agreement, the fact that they entered into that international accord, the US walked away and effectively made a mockery of a decade of talks and diplomacy. I think diplomacy is dead, at least from the Iranian perspective. I think the strike in Iraq has really made that quite clear, and there's just no critical capital for the moderates in Iran to advocate a diplomatic approach given what's happened. They've really been slapped in the face over this nuclear agreement. I think what there is a calculation. Everything that the Iranian state does, despite what many people think, Iran is a rational state actor. It will look at its calculations, what's in its national interest and what it can exploit the most, what it can get out of this, I suppose. But also nobody wants to enter a war which would be a suicidal kind of war from the Iranian perspective, if we're talking a conventional sense. I think what the Iranians could do is exploit its critical capital in the region, put pressure on American assets around the Middle East, in places like Iraq, of course, very unpopular, the presence of US troops at the moment. Other places, of course, Lebanon, Syria, the Persian Gulf states, where the United States has quite a huge military build-up and assets scattered around that region.
Soleimani has been described as a ruthless killer by the Americans. U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo says he was plotting an imminent attack and the risk of doing nothing was enormous. And yet, Soraya, they have not really offered any evidence to back this up.
The United States hasn't really offered any kind of evidence in this entire debacle. From that rocket attack that killed the US contractor, for example, the US was very swift to blame the Iranians for that, but they hadn't really offered any kind of proof or evidence. Let's not forget that the US has bombed a sovereign state. That's the state of Iraq, which seems to be lost in all of this. They've not just bombed the state of Iraq today, but this is the second time in around 4 days. If you recall, they targeted the PMUs, Hezbollah, which Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes was in charge of. He also died alongside Soleimani in that strike near the Baghdad airport. I don't think the United States is in a moral position right now to be pointing the finger at anyone when they're flagrantly violating international law.
And the U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo also says de-escalation is still the U.S. principal goal, but it sure doesn't look that way.
It's a very curious thing for Pompeo to say. It seems as though, including that de-escalation comment, a very curious one, and obviously there's not a lot to back that up factually when you look at what the United States is doing. You don't just take out a senior Iranian official, and I will point out Soleimani was not a militia leader, he wasn't some kind of a proxy military guy, he was well within the chain of command, a senior figure in the Iranian Republic and military structure, which reported directly to the Supreme Leader's office. I don't think there's an idea that the US is de-escalating anything. I think it's all part of a maximum pressure strategy in trying to push Iran further into a corner, further towards institutional collapse within the country.